She was the pride of the Royal Canadian Navy, a majestic symbol of Canada's Cold War strength. But her story is one of both triumph and tragedy, a reminder that even the mightiest vessels can meet an untimely end. This is the HMCS Bonaventure, Canada's last aircraft carrier. If you're a longtime viewer of this channel, you might remember a video we produced on the Bonaventure about 10 years ago. Well, today we're diving back in with fresh research and a deeper look at this fascinating ship. Our story begins not in Canada, but in the shipyards of Belfast, Northern Ireland. Laid down in 1943 as HMS Powerful, she was intended to be one of the Royal Navy's new light fleet carriers. These were smaller than the fleet carriers like the new American Essex class, but still packed a punch. But World War II ended before Powerful could be completed, and she languished in mothballs for years. That's where Canada stepped in. In the early 1950s, the Royal Canadian Navy was in need of a modern aircraft carrier to replace the HMCS Magnificent. The Maggie, as she was affectionately known, was a veteran of World War II, on loan from the Royal Navy. It became clear that Canada needed a carrier better suited to its needs, and that's where HMS Powerful entered the picture. In 1952, the Royal Canadian Navy purchased Powerful for $21 million, or about $241 million in today's money. After a significant refit to prepare her for the jet age, she was commissioned as HMCS Bonaventure on January 17, 1957. The Bonnie, as she was affectionately known, was equipped with a modern air wing for the time. She carried McDonnell F-2H-3 Banshee fighters, Grumman S-2F tracker anti-submarine aircraft, and Sikorsky H-04S helicopters. This gave her a versatile capability, able to protect the fleet from air attack, hunt submarines, and conduct search and rescue operations. Interestingly, the trackers flown by the Royal Canadian Navy were unique. When Canada acquired them, it turned out the original Grumman design was just a bit too long to fit on Bonaventure's elevators, which were used to move aircraft between the flight deck and the hangar deck below. To solve this, de Havilland Canada stepped in and modified the trackers at their Toronto factory. They produced a version that was almost a foot shorter that fit Bonaventure's dimensions perfectly. Now, it's important to put Bonaventure's size into perspective. Compared to American carriers of the era, like the USS Essex, she was indeed smaller, as seen in this photo of the Bonnie and the Essex sailing side by side. The Essex-class carriers were true fleet carriers, designed to operate a much larger air wing and support major offensive operations. Bonaventure was closer in size and capability to the U.S. Navy's light carriers, like those of the Independence class. And those were much smaller than the American Forrestal-class fleet carriers entering service in the early days of the Cold War. This meant that Bonaventure had a smaller aircraft capacity and perhaps slightly less range and endurance than the Essex class. However, she was still more than capable of fulfilling Canada's naval needs at the time. She could operate a versatile mix of aircraft, contribute to NATO operations, and protect Canadian waters. And as we'll see, she was ready to answer the call during international crises. In October 1962, the world watched with bated breath as the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded. While the eyes of the world were fixed on the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, Canada was quietly playing a vital role in the tense standoff. The Bonaventure, just 5 years into her service, was suddenly thrust onto the front lines of a potential nuclear conflict. Bonaventure was dispatched with all haste to join the American fleet, forming a quarantine line around Cuba. Captain F.C. Frewer, commander of the Bonaventure at the time, later recalled the urgency of the situation.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was really exciting. I don't think still the public are aware how near a thing it was. Aircraft carriers were spaced about 150 miles apart, all the way north of Cuba. One of the Essex-class carriers was just to the south of us, the Lake Champlain, I believe it was. We were at the northern end of the picket line.
But what the public, and even many in the Canadian government, didn't know was that Prime Minister John Diefenbaker was hesitant to commit Canada fully to the US-led blockade. He was caught in a political dilemma, torn between supporting his allies and avoiding a potential war with the Soviet Union. In the face of this indecision, Rear Admiral Kenneth Dyer, Canadian commander of the Atlantic Fleet, took a bold step. He and his maritime air deputy, Air Commodore William Clements, quietly put the Navy on a war footing, recalling the Bonnie from UK waters and deploying her under the guise of a routine exercise. They knew the risks, their careers and potentially the lives of their sailors were on the line.
I think the decision was going to be made within 2 to 3 hours as to whether we were going to war. So we were part of the operation, covering the northern flank alert and ready to go with war-loaded aircraft. It was exciting because we knew at the time that there were some submarines accompanying the missile-carrying freighters.
Bonaventure's tracker aircraft, equipped with sophisticated submarine detection gear, were a key part of the effort to monitor and deter these underwater threats. Despite the risks they took and the vital role they played, the Canadian government's reluctance to officially acknowledge their participation meant that the crew of Bonaventure received no public recognition for their efforts. While other countries received certificates of appreciation from the United States, Canada's contribution remained unacknowledged, a silent testament to the political complexities of the Cold War. In the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Bonaventure continued to serve with distinction. She remained a vital part of the Royal Canadian Navy, participating in NATO exercises, conducting anti-submarine patrols, and representing Canada on the international stage. During these exercises, the Bonnie's relatively small size became a topic of conversation and even some contention among Allied pilots. Many American pilots, accustomed to the larger decks of their carriers, were hesitant to attempt landings on Bonaventure's shorter flight deck. Some even considered the Canadian naval pilots crazy for regularly landing their aircraft on what they perceived as the size of a postage stamp. In the mid-1960s, the Bonaventure underwent a major midlife refit intended to extend her service life well into the late 1970s. New equipment was installed, her systems were upgraded, and her hull was refurbished. It seemed that the Bonaventure was ready for many more years of service, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. In 1968, Pierre Elliott Trudeau became Prime Minister of Canada. His government, focused on social programs and domestic priorities, took a different view of the military's role. Defense spending came under scrutiny, and the Navy in particular faced significant cuts. The decision to scrap the Bonnie was met with shock and dismay by many within both the Navy and the public. Petitions were circulated and debates raged in Parliament, but the government held firm. In 1970, just 3 years after her major refit, the Bonaventure was decommissioned in her home port of Halifax. Her crew, once filled with pride and purpose, now faced the somber task of preparing their beloved ship for disposal. In 1971, the Bonaventure was towed to Taiwan and scrapped. Her once proud hull was cut apart, her equipment dismantled, and her legacy left to the history books. It was an ignominious end for a ship that had served Canada so well. Bonaventure's roles were diverse. She served as a training ground for naval aviators, honing their skills in the challenging environment of carrier operations. She participated in NATO exercises, demonstrating Canada's commitment to collective defense, and she was always ready to respond to crises, as she would prove during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, what if the Bonnie had been kept in service? It's hard to say for sure, but it's likely she would have continued to play a valuable role in the North Atlantic, protecting Canadian waters and supporting NATO allies. Some argue that her early demise left a gap in Canada's naval capabilities, a gap that has yet to be fully filled. Today, the Bonaventure is remembered as a symbol of Canadian naval aviation and a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who served aboard her. Her story is a poignant one, a testament to the ever-changing tides of politics and the unpredictable nature of history. To the sailors who walked her decks, flew her aircraft, and kept her running, this story of HMCS Bonaventure is dedicated to you. And to all those who called Bonaventure home, may your memories of her never fade.